Okay, we are recording, folks. I'm going to turn this over to retired Colonel Doug Hurst to introduce our guest speaker. Then we have the slides here from our presenter, Rocco Santurri. We'll switch from some remarks to this first set of slides and then a second one with images, and then field some questions from you. Doug?
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Doug Hurst with Third Order Effects. Welcome to what has become kind of a bi-weekly webinar, but not always every other week, sometimes once a month. But as we find people with an interesting topic that we think our network will enjoy talking about or listening to, we try to highlight them. Today, we have something near and dear to my heart, civil affairs. We have Rocco Santurri, who is a civil affairs officer. He's also conducted CA missions as a team chief in Afghanistan, Korea, the Philippines, served as an aide-de-camp for USACAPOC to Brigadier General Stockel, was instructor at the Special Warfare Education Group. Last year, he completed a deployment in support of Operation Atlantic Resolve, which was co-located, and Rocco and I chatted about this beforehand because my embassy experience was a little bit different, but he was at the U.S. Embassy in Budapest. Probably an envious place for other CA folks to want to be. While his team was there, they conducted polling throughout the country to capture populist sentiment on a host of national and international issues. He's also launched several strategic communication initiatives through the U.S. Embassy Public Affairs section. With that, I'm not going to take up any more time, and I will turn it over to you, Rocco.
All right, thanks, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone in attendance. Good to see you on here. So I'd like to start off with just an introduction and a bit of a background on the mission that we had, and then we'll get into some polling results and some imagery. I deployed as part of a 4-person civil affairs team, and when we got into theater, the main partners that we worked with were the Office of Defense Cooperation, Hungarian government, Hungarian Ministry of Defense, and the CMC POC, which is the Hungarian CIMIC cell, which is a combination of both CA and PSYOP. We also worked with the NIFU, NATO Force Integration Unit, and also the International Red Cross. We were actually co-located with the ODC and with Hungarian CIMIC, which was extremely important for us from an operational standpoint and in terms of being able to work with our partners. For the actual mission itself, it was really 3 pillars. The first was exercise support. BISBRI is a collection of exercises, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with Atlantic Resolve. There were multiple exercises going on, and we worked with our Hungarian partners to conduct shaping operations, mitigate any issues, and conduct AARs so that we could do this even better down the road. Another part of that, the second part of our mission was really measuring populist sentiment. We did that through a good amount of ways, which we'll get into a little bit later via the PowerPoint. And lastly, we were there to conduct strategic communication messaging through the embassy website. And we wanted to, ideally, what we really wanted to do was consolidate our messaging with partners. Given that environment, a lot of malign actors and other information operations going on, we felt this was absolutely critical to our success. It was definitely stressed to me from my battalion commander throughout. And as we'll cover later, we did have some mixed results, but some successes. First, for the exercise support, we conducted shaping operations with joint teams with my Hungarian counterparts who were absolutely excellent all the way through, very professional. We went to meet governors, mayors, transportation authorities, and really we just wanted to ensure there was minimal interference with the civilian populace in the vicinity of the exercises and the border crossings. Overall, this was successful. We did have one or two minor issues, one of which Russia Times RT tried to exploit, but it was rather minimal. We were able to mitigate that with our own messaging. A couple vehicles ran off the road. RT described it as an agricultural onslaught, using their words to describe the incident. It was basically a very small incident, but we were able to get out in front of that and make sure the sentiment remained positive. The second part of our mission for populist sentiment, most of the methods that we used, polling, community events, static displays, which our maneuver friends were very adamant about, atmospherics, informal conversations, and we also observed rallies and protests. We'll get to the results of that, but overall we felt like we had a good amount of success with that, particularly with polling with our Hungarian counterparts and the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Third piece of the puzzle was the strategic communications. We conducted that through the embassy webpage. We really tried to get joint messaging out using the dissemination portals of the Hungarian government, the military, and also NIFU as well too. In reality, the successes there were rather limited. I think the main issue we had was really getting a joint platform and also a joint message, not only on our side of the house, but also with our partners. And we do have some ideas going forward of how we might be able to mitigate that in the future. Some of the other challenges we had, of course, were the malign influences in the area, and also too, their ability to get out their information operations a lot faster than us. I think also the rigidity of our messaging content hurt us to a certain degree on our side of the house. We promoted some of the messaging given to us was a little bit more of a zero-sum game mentality, and that we were there specifically due to the threat to the east. And we wanted our Hungarian counterparts to be cognizant of that and to basically have the same type of views on it we had, which, as we'll cover later, were a little bit different for obvious reasons. You could say that the messaging was a little bit one size fits all, and we felt like it needed to be nuanced, which we'll discuss. So observations overall, we thought it was very telling that our ambassador routinely would refer to Hungary as a work in progress, as an ally, a quote unquote ally with the lowercase a. We felt like there were some misaligned strategic communication themes, as I discussed. And I think also too, we saw this a little bit, that we had a failure to understand a bit of the Hungarian psyche vis-a-vis the popularity of Prime Minister Orbán, in terms of the country being supportive of an authoritarian leader who was very, very, very strong on immigration, promoted nationalism, and saw Russia more as a partner as opposed to an adversary, as we saw. So going forward, we really want to stress the importance of joint messaging, NATO interoperability versus deterrence, maybe a little more economic centric, given the fact that the Russians and the Chinese have kind of gone that route with great success in Hungary, as the Russians actually have a nuclear power plant in PAX, and there is Chinese investment with Huawei. Avoiding some of the political themes, and most importantly, what we got out of this, as always, we have to be cognizant of historical, social, cultural attitudes in the country we're operating in, and why people think the way they do, so that we can craft the proper messaging that it provides the most value and the most realism in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. One last piece of this, current developments. COVID has had something to do with Hungary as it goes forward. Washington Post had an article declaring that Hungary was the first democracy to die because of COVID, given that Prime Minister Orbán used a supermajority in parliament to enact stronger powers for himself. That's a developing situation, and we'll see how that goes going forward. So if we can, I'd like to get into the survey results so we can give you a little idea of what some of the populace had to say. All right, this is just a cover page. The HDF, CMC POC, did most of the heavy lifting on this. Myself, my team, and 2CR were able to talk to those who crafted the surveys to discuss some of the questions. So you can go ahead to the next slide. All right, this slide just shows some of the towns that were involved in the polling. And the idea was to get a bigger cross-section of the country. There was some interest in possibly conducting some of this in Budapest, but it was believed that really wouldn't be as accurate given the amount of people in Budapest who really are, for all intent and purposes, are not Hungarian. We felt like it would be better in different parts of the country. Next slide, please. All right, and this just gives you the general direction of some of the areas that we covered, starting in Veszprém in the west, and going all the way through. And again, this was just the idea of trying to get as a diverse an amount of people as possible to make these results more of an accurate description of how the nation feels. Next slide, please. You could just keep running it forward, please. And those are the areas that we hit. All right, gender and age. This wasn't exactly symmetrical as hoped, but for the most part, again, we felt on both the male and female side, there was a pretty wide disparity in terms of who we talked to, in terms of age. And I think this gives us a pretty accurate picture of some of the numbers that we pulled in. Next slide, please. All right, so we started off with some pretty basic questioning, but one of the big parts of us being there, of course, was the exercise support. And we really wanted to know, based on all of the information that went out, how many people knew about the exercises. And we did find out that about 65% did not know about the exercises at all. What was a little disconcerting on this as well too was some of the areas that had a pretty heavy influence that there was not knowledge of, that the exercises were actually taking place. Now, in terms of the percentage that actually did know what was going on, in terms of the exercises, we were able to determine from where they were getting their information, which we found, not surprisingly, the internet was the area or the portal in which they got most of their information, to be followed by literally personally seeing or hearing military vehicles. And that makes sense a little bit as well, because we were operating in some very rural areas. So it might make sense for people to really only have their eyes to be able to see what exactly was coming through. Next slide, please. All right, the purpose of the exercises, again, majority did not know what the purpose was. If you go to the next slide, we'll break this down a little further. Okay, and if you did know where the exercise was coming from, again, we wanted to try to figure out going forward for our own strategic communications reasons, what was the most effective way to communicate with people. And again, we looked mostly, it was the internet, TV, and also too, in some of the rural areas, I think a lot of it was word of mouth. Some of the areas that we visited were very, very small with a very small amount of people. And usually if we're able to talk to the mayor, he was able to spread it throughout and get the message out. Next slide, please. All right, this chart right here, in terms of those who have heard about the exercises, this just gives you a breakdown of which locations, what their numbers were. And if you look at the bottom, a little interesting point on the right all the way down, Varpalota is a very, very large training facility in Varpalota. And we expected to have a little bit more awareness of what was going on. We did not actually, which was a little bit of a surprise. Overall, we were expecting that, but we didn't get it. And that's something that we'll have to evaluate going forward, because obviously some of our methods, even in areas that were very close to the exercises, were not successful in getting the message out. Next slide, please. All right, in supporting NATO activity in Hungary, this was pretty overwhelming. We were, on a personal level, welcomed very warmly by our counterparts. We were welcomed throughout society, particularly we were in Székesfehérvár and Budapest, our two main areas. And there was a lot of support for it. There were some, as we found more in the rural areas, occasionally there might be a little more hesitancy. There might be, as it says in the chart above, doubtful or theoretically yes. But for the most part, overall, I feel like the NATO support has been very strong, especially if you compare and contrast that to some of the national sentiment among certain aspects of the populace towards the EU. Next slide, please. This was a question that we were really interested in getting some answers to in light of events in the past. Obviously, historically, some Hungarians did mention our Affiliate Act in 1956, and also too, the situation in Ukraine. And it was a little disheartening to see that we did have a little less than half thinking that NATO would come to aid Hungary if attacked, and also too, a pretty sizable amount thinking it's possible. But obviously we definitely detected a good amount of skepticism. And I think a lot of that, as previously noted, is due to some events in the past and even in the recent past. Next slide, please. It's an interesting slide right here. What the world threat that concerns you the most, or what is the world threat that concerns you the most? I think it's very telling. Immigration scores very high on this at 26.3%. That is a hot button issue in Hungary. And it's been a source of some serious disagreement between EU, Mr. Juncker at the EU, who is no longer there, and Prime Minister Orbán. And I think that's a very, very telling statistic, and it gives you a little bit of an insight into what the priorities are and what some of the concerns are for the country. Next slide, please. World threats in terms of what concerns people the most. Again, this is just a breakdown of the previous slide. Immigration leading the way. I won't spend too much time on this as we're a little short on time. So next slide, please. And do you think NATO could protect Hungary from this threat? This was actually geared towards a force-on-force invasion. Again, for a NATO partner, not exactly a ringing endorsement. There was a sizable amount that thought so, but again, still some skepticism. Next slide, please. Immediate actions of Hungarians, potentially, if they were to learn that war was coming to Hungary. Obviously, a sizable amount think that the best option would be to go elsewhere. And there was also a little bit, a sizable amount in terms of actually staying, and then some joined the military or ensure the safety of their family. So mixed results, but sensible to a certain degree, especially with some of the conversations I've had with my Hungarian counterparts, you know, given the proxemics and their concern about the quick reaction capabilities of NATO. Next slide, please. In this slide, we really wanted to, again, get back down to what source of information are most important. I thought in case of war, I thought this was rather interesting that the bulk of people we spoke to, it was about what they could see, what they could verify with their own two eyes. And that overwhelmingly was the source of information they would trust the most. So as opposed to some of the other slides where there seemed like a heavy reliance upon the internet, that sort of faded off in terms of reliability if there was a conflict going on. All right, if you could switch to the other slide deck. And what I want to show you guys is just some imagery that we captured there that tell a little bit of the tale of some of the issues that we encountered while we were there, and some of the imagery that really does tell a story. So first off, the Treaty of Trianon was, after World War I, Hungarians lost about 70% of their territory and about 13 million of their civilians. I mention this because you do see some of these signs throughout the country, and it is still very, very much in the public conscience. Prime Minister Orbán used this rather skillfully to promote his party and himself from a standpoint of stoking some nationalist feelings and promoting what has been, within reason, a sort of authoritarian, illiberal democracy that currently is gripping Hungary, so to speak. Next slide, please. This is some of the strategic communications from Hungary after the issue with Mr. Juncker, who's, if you look at the top right, he is top right picture, he is on the right, and to his left is Mr. Soros. Most of these pictures on the top right and bottom left went out after the dispute between EU over immigration. And this was done by the government practically overnight. Thousands of these signs were put all over the country. And the loose translation that I was told was that this was telling the Hungarian people that they should be aware of what Brussels is doing there, either on their behalf or that might affect them. The top left is, you can't really see that very well, but it's NATO, NEM, which is NATO no. We didn't really encounter too much of any negativity towards NATO. This sign in particular, or this painting, however you want to say it, looked like it was actually rather dated. And last but not least, on the bottom right, did not see too much from Antifa. We did see a few Antifa signs promoting different cities, but I did not see much of that in Budapest. Next slide, please. Protests were done in a very orderly fashion. We felt like the security services were very professional, and this was allowed to happen. What we did notice, though, the protests, the rallies, unlike 2017, 2018, none of these had much of a political anti-Fidesz, which is Prime Minister Orbán's party, feel to them. Most of this was, from what we saw, was on different issues, which in this case was climate control. Next slide, please. This slide, this was a particular rally. There was a pretty heavy Turkish element, and the concern was the partnership or communication between President Erdogan of Turkey and Prime Minister Orbán, and some concerns in Hungary over that, in addition to some of the issues or some of the concerns with the partnership with Russia. Again, the protests were relatively peaceful. This was really the only one we saw that had more of a political flavor to it, as I said before, versus 2017 or 2018. Next slide, please. And this is a picture from before, from that, the climate control, climate rally. I wanted to put this in here because this is directly in front of the parliament. So the ability to protest did not seem to be hindered. There was a good amount of speeches afterwards. But what we saw was, for the most part, if it wasn't political, they was allowed to really air their grievances. Next slide. This is some of the signage that we saw for the elections. What we did notice, there was some damage to some of the opposition party signs. That was, we noticed that a little bit more often than not. We did also know there was about a 2 to 3 to 1 advantage for the Fidesz party in terms of signage versus the opposition. That raised some eyebrows, given the fact that the government does control financing of campaigns. The average Hungarian will not donate to their party, and they go through the government. And we were concerned slightly that perhaps some of that funding was withheld to certain parties. Last slide, please. And this is another political poster, and the eyes are taken out on this. We didn't really see too much of this for the most part, where something is maliciously damaged. For the most part, it seems like the signs were able to be seen and were not torn down or anything of that nature. But again, we did notice a pretty discernible difference in the amount of signs from Fidesz versus the other parties. All right, so that's the last slide right there. I tried very hard to give you a sort of an insight of what we saw. And to be perfectly honest with you, I was there for 9 months, and this is something that I could spend a very, very long time talking about. There's a lot of parts I would say for the most part, we've definitely skipped over, but I wanted to at least give you a snapshot in terms of what's going on. But one thing I just want to finish with quickly from the STRATCOM standpoint, I feel like if a better understanding of the political, social, cultural, even historical aspects of Hungary would have enabled us to craft a better message. And I do feel, again, that there was a little too much rigidity in terms of our message. And I think that especially with Hungary, a country that when the wall fell was one of the oldest countries in Hungary, now has a much younger population, they see some countries that we're concerned about more as partners. And I think that for us going forward, in addition to having joint messaging and all being on the same page, both US and non-US, I think we do have to look at a little bit of that economic aspect of it and maybe have messaging that is more DOS than DOD. So pending your questions, that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Rocco, there's a couple questions in the chat. Can you see those?
All right. Okay, so first question. Do you want to just read it aloud?
That's fine.
Okay. Good afternoon. I have two questions. It seems a very PSYOPs and STRATCOM heavy activity for a CA country team. Did you get the training for doing it specifically as a CA team back in the States? I appreciate much the CA and CIMIC close cooperation. Do you see the two capabilities should be more synchronized than right now? And Major Chavo, good to see you. Former HDF, CMC, POC officer, and CIC branch. I think that the training we got, it definitely could have been, I think, a little more nuanced to where we were going. And I understand that there are, you know, it's very, very difficult in terms of all the requirements we have to deploy. It's not easy to do all of that and then have a team come together very late and find out what their country is. I was originally supposed to go to Poland and I got moved over to Hungary. So I think the training was adequate, but with more training, do I think we could do a better job? I absolutely do think that. In terms of the CA and CIMIC close cooperation, I do think they should be more synchronized. A lot of times in theater, particularly in Afghanistan, we would cross-load our teams to get to have a team that have more capability. And I think that was a serious flaw that I saw in other theaters where there was a wide disparity between what PSYOP and what CA was doing. Moving on to the next question. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on conducting surveys from the populace of an allied member of an alliance. What interactions did you have with local authorities at the national and provincial level? And were you working directly under the supervision of the US Embassy SDO, or are there some type of NATO or DoD entity in prep for the military exercise? So starting from the top, interactions with local authorities were very, very good. It was very easy to gain access. Our Hungarian counterparts, we conducted all joint meetings, of course, with them in the lead. We referred to them as CETs, combined engagement teams. What we got out of a lot of the local authorities, particularly in the rural areas, they've seen this before. They've seen a large military come through. We use a lot of the same bases that were used during the Cold War, except now it's us. So what we got from a lot of the people we spoke with, they were very well versed in what was going on, what we were there to do. And I felt like that the cooperation was outstanding, not only from our counterparts, but from the majority of people that we met. And working in terms of our authorizations and our chain of command, we worked, our bosses, battalion commander forward, they were in Poland. They provided most of our guidance, but we really, really hitched our wagons to the ODC, especially the DAT and the ODC chief. And they were able to feed us a pretty good amount of missions that really enhanced our mission, and they gave us access that we did not have otherwise. So our overall guidance was coming from Poland, but I would say ODC, hands down, was extremely important in terms of our mission. And I also see entity, let's see, some other type of NATO or DoD entity and prep for the military exercise. You know, for the exercises, really, it was us and the Hungarians. Obviously, before the deployment, it was JMRC, but that was the extent of it. Moving on to the next question. Scroll down here. What are some of the major points of friction and cooperation between DOS and DoD objectives? Again, I think with DOS, it probably was a little bit more of a holistic approach. I felt like with DoD, it was definitely a little more focused specifically to the exercise and specifically to the threat to the east. I thought it was interesting, a conversation I had with the Hungarian officer, and we talked a little bit about some of the messaging, and he just said, you know, it was a very candid conversation. He just said, hey, you know, we in the past haven't picked very well in terms of allies. And while I think the messaging from US to Hungary was trying to get an all-in commitment, I feel like the Hungarians are trying to maintain partnerships and being on friendly basis as possible as they can, given the situation they're in, the geography, and a lot of the other considerations. So I thought that was an interesting off-the-record comment, and I think it in some ways does make some sense. Next question. Hungary was one of the original NATO III Partnership for Peace Nations. In your assessment, has this venture been successful? I won't touch much on that, just to be fully honest. I don't have too much information on that whatsoever. When I was there, it was not something that was discussed in any level whatsoever.
I don't see questions there in the chat. I do have a question for you. One of the problems that has just been typical of our kind of the way we do business is stovepiping of information. So when you would bring back your information, how widespread was it used just with the SDO-DAT, or was it shared amongst your DOS counterparts?
We really adopted as an SOP that we wanted to get this out to everyone, and really so that we could just promote sharing in general. And we were hoping it was going to be reciprocated, which we feel like it was. So we, as much as we were allowed to do, we pushed out all of our information. We sat in on all synchronization meetings, weekly meetings, anything we could do to talk to more people, to hear what they were doing, let them understand what we were doing so we could get on the same page. Because it just, again, that the fragmentation was pretty severe. And I think that going forward, whether it's some type of joint working group, some type of multi-compo environment, that's something that is definitely needs to be addressed.
What is your knowledge of this type of activities as far as the surveying taking place in other countries? I know at my time at the embassy in Kuwait, this was not part of anything that came out of the SDO-DAT's office. Is this something that we should expand further to gain more information on the ground from our partners, or is it kind of like pick and choose which country to go after?
Every country, might be different, obviously, especially if there's a security issue. But I think for OAR, I think this is an outstanding opportunity to not only train with your partners, but to be conducting operations. And I think if we're able to feed that forward, the information that we receive up our chain of command, I think it's going to affect the validity and really the value of what we're trying to do and some of the messaging. Unfortunately, I was pretty disappointed when we submitted our answers to, or excuse me, we submitted the results. We got very, very minimal feedback from our chain of command. I actually had a call to make sure it was received because it was a pretty large PowerPoint. So I didn't really see a tremendous difference. The messaging pretty much stayed the same. It was very fixated on kinetics. And I think that for the very, very fascinating place that is Hungary, for the history, for what their outlook is, I think it really required a specialized solution. And I got the same feedback from my counterparts in Romania, Bulgaria, and also Slovakia. So I felt like those four were experiencing a very similar environment versus Poland, where they were quote unquote drinking the Kool-Aid. So I definitely think that we need to put more into it than just putting something that might be perceived as a little cookie cutter.
All right, thanks. Do we have any other questions? You can either raise your hand, I can unmute your mic, or you can type it there into the, or I guess you can unmute your own mic. or type a question into the chat box. Going once, going twice, 3 times. Rocco, what are some final comments you'd like to make?
Really, I think from a CA standpoint, the final comment I would just like to make is that really, you know, having understanding of the country and not just, you know, more of like the PME CA scope, which I think is obviously important, but really culturally, socially, listening to what the country is going through, empathizing. I think it can never, ever be underestimated in civil affairs in terms of who you're working with. And I think the ability to do that, the ability to live there, to live amongst people, and to listen to the hundreds of conversations we had on and off the record gave us a very interesting insight to the country. But more importantly, I think it brought us together and really involved some true interoperability.
I 100% agree with that, and it's one reason we do these webinars. So hopefully everybody attending will take it. These will, I heard earlier, will be recorded and we'll send out via email, but also always available on our website. So take information, spread it wide and far, and appreciate everybody being with us this afternoon. Rocco, I really appreciate your time. It was good information.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all. I appreciate it.